Hello and welcome to this video lecture for the University of Connecticut's online course, Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies 1103, Classical Mythology. I'm Roger Travis, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Connecticut, and whether you're enrolled in this course or not, I hope you enjoy the lecture and learn something about new ways of looking at classics and at myth. Thanks for watching.
And now we get to talk about Troy, the story that was, without a doubt, the most important story of all to the people of ancient Greece, and in particular because it's the place where the myths that we have all come from, to the people of ancient Athens. Indeed, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are both part of the story of Troy, the Trojan War, and its aftermath, are the closest equivalent that ancient Greece had to what we think of as scripture. That is, the Bible, whether you're talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, or you're talking about the Christian Bible with the New Testament, or you're talking about another sacred text like the Quran. And although, as I spent a lot of time trying to get you to realize, the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the other epics that are mostly lost, began as oral recompositions that were not in any way set before they were written down. By the time we get to Athens, we're talking about a period in Greek culture when Homer is thought of as a writer, and those who are still performing his works, the people who are called rhapsodes, are performing them pretty much exactly the same way every time. So that in what's usually called the Golden Age of Greece, the classical period, roughly between 500 BCE and 200 BCE, the story of Troy, as it's thought of by the Athenians, is more or less fixed, as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and to a lesser extent the other epics which have already begun to be lost. When our two first historians in Western culture, Herodotus and Thucydides, come to introduce their histories, Herodotus of the Persian Wars and Thucydides of the Peloponnesian War, they begin by talking about Homer and about how they view the evidence that Homer gives. That is, they begin by talking about the Trojan War, and both of them clearly believe that their audiences, mostly Athenians, are going to have in their minds as the greatest war ever to this point in human history, the Trojan War. And so both of them, Herodotus and Thucydides, put their wars in explicit competition with the Trojan War, and both of them say that their wars, the Persian Wars for Herodotus and the Peloponnesian War for Thucydides, are greater than the Trojan War as described by Homer. What that means, of course, is that the Athenians think of Homer as history. They think of the Trojan War as having actually occurred. This actually makes my job quite difficult for two reasons. The first is that this is a class in mythology, so I need to treat the Trojan War as a myth. But more importantly, I have to get you past the very romantic notion, which a lot of people even today still share, that there is an essential historicity to the Trojan War. Because it's only when we let go of that romantic notion that we can really begin to see how important the Trojan War was and is as myth. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at Troy in two ways. The first is a way that in the end I consider fun and worthwhile if you enjoy it, but in the end not the most rewarding way to look at Troy, and that is to look at Troy as actual history, and to try to take the Iliad especially, and also to some extent the Odyssey, apart and try to figure out what actually happened. You can't see my air quotes, but I'm making them. What actually happened in ancient Asia Minor in around 1200 BCE, which is when the Greeks seem to have thought that the Trojan War took place. So that's way number one, which I tend to think of as a non-way to look at Troy, but I'm not going to try to stop you if that's what floats your boat when it comes to thinking about Troy. Way number two to look at Troy, which I consider to be the most helpful way and the most rewarding way to look at Troy, is to look at Troy as myth, and in particular to look at the myth of Troy as embodied in the Iliad, whose title as given to it from ancient Athens onward means the story of Troy, which is actually a little weird because the Iliad as we have it, even though it's in 24 books, nevertheless only covers something around 20 days in the last year of the war. It doesn't describe the beginning of the war. It definitely doesn't describe the end of the war, although it indicates in the end of the epic that the end of the war is going to follow sometime relatively soon. And yet it's nevertheless called the story of Troy. How can this be? Well, we're going to try to figure that out, and then we're going to try to figure out what it meant in terms of rooty things, cultural truth values, to the ancient Greeks, and in particular to the ancient Athenians. So first, Troy as actual history. Why do we have this desire, I always wonder, to find a way in which the story of Troy can be made true? I actually think it's the same desire that led the Greeks themselves to try to put the whole story together. To have the whole story of your past, which incorporates your most dearly held beliefs, turned into a kind of continuous history, is itself a sort of rooty thing, a truth value. That is, if you have this story of how you came to be who you are, it endorses your most basic values, that you are a whole and autonomous being. So I think it's completely natural to want Troy to be history. The problem is, of course, that it ends up being very frustrating. And as far as I've been able to tell, the only way to get past that frustration is to begin to falsify the actual truth of the matter. So where can we start? Well, we can start with looking at what we have of the story of the Trojan War, and also what we've lost of the story of the Trojan War. Here's what we have. As you can see, the list is headed by the Iliad and the Odyssey. And just for starters, we need to realize that the Iliad and the Odyssey both obviously have a lot of mythological trappings, like the participation of the Olympian gods, that I'd like to think we can all recognize as clearly non-historical. We also, very importantly, have a bunch of stuff that's kind of on the edges of the Iliad and the Odyssey, things like tragedies, things like fragments of lyric, and maybe most importantly, the bare remnants, that is, summaries of these other epics that used to exist, and which the Greeks thought of as part of what they called the epic cycle. Now, the epic cycle, in its largest understanding, is a string of epics that takes us from the very beginning of the universe, for example, the Theogony, all the way to almost historical present. But on the more usual and limited understanding, the epic cycle is more or less the whole story of the Trojan War, outside of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and in addition to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And thus it features very prominently in the stuff that we've lost. Now, there's a serious problem with using even what we know of the epics of the epic cycle as evidence for what actually happened at Troy. The problem is that it seems that these epics of the epic cycle were composed later than the Iliad and the Odyssey, and presuppose the Iliad and the Odyssey as the material about which they're writing. Maybe more importantly, these epics are obviously of a very different kind from the Iliad and the Odyssey. The best example is probably the Cypria, which covers everything from the wedding of Peleus and Thetis up through the landing at Troy, and it does so in only 11 books, whereas the Iliad takes 24 books to get through about 20 days in the last year of the war.